Yesterday, we ran out of time. So I said, reading this green section was on your own. And that was number 6 on the back side, the top of the back side of our comprehension. How did the Farmers Holiday Association try to relieve problems of the Great Depression? Who can give me one of the ways, one of the things we learned about? Harper. Yeah, so remember the food was worth just a little bit because there was so much food. So they couldn't charge a lot. So they prevented food from going to the market, so the demand, the demand went up, so the money could go up. So they prevented the food from going to market to raise the prices, and then people were able to make money. What else happened? Adeline?
They helped force prices up.
Say it again.
They helped force prices up.
Yeah, and the way they helped force prices up was by preventing food to the market. What else, James?
They also try to stop the bank from stealing farmers and houses.
So there's a thing called foreclosure. Foreclosure is still around today. When you buy a house, most people don't have $300,000, $500,000 in money in the bank to say, okay, I can buy it outright. They have to get a loan. It's called a mortgage, right? You need to buy a new tractor. People buying new cars today. A lot of people get loans for that. So you don't fully own it. You're having to pay the bank every month. Once you get it all paid off, then you get the title and you own it 100% yourself. But until then, the bank owns it and you're paying the bank until you can get it all paid off. If you can't make your payments, the bank will say, you have missed way too many payments. We're gonna foreclose on your house. We're gonna repossess whatever, the tractor, your car, whatever it is that you were borrowing for. We're gonna take it back and you lose it all. All the money that you had put towards it already, you lose that and we own it. Then they have something called foreclosure auctions, where the bank will sell it off to whoever can afford it. And that's how the bank recoups some of their money for the stuff that people couldn't afford to pay back. So what this organization did is they would get all these people together and go to the auction, and something that was, let's say, a house for back then, let's say like $1,000 for your farmhouse. And people would say, I'll give you a dime for it, because it's an auction. And then somebody else says, I'll raise it to 11 cents. And then somebody says, wow, I'll see that 11 cents and I'll take 12 cents. And then nobody else bets, nobody else puts any bids on it. And the bank is forced to sell this whole big house for 12 cents. And then the person who bought it says, oh, that was your farm that I just bought. Here, you can have the title for it. And that was their way to be able to get things back to the farmers that were being foreclosed on, that had been repossessed. They would kind of flood these auctions so they wouldn't make money. So they were helping the farmers. James.
How much would a cent be in like the 1900s?
I don't know. All right.
Please excuse this interruption. This is your friendly last call for the book fair. This is your last call for the book fair. Please get your teacher's permission to see if you may go to the library, as this is the last call for the book fair.
And
Thank you.
Mrs. White took care of all of that, I believe, so we should be fine. All right, so let's look at after the crash, what was happening. Oh no, that's still before the crash. So after the crash. All right, number 7, how did private organizations help jobless and homeless people? So let's hear some of the things that would happen.
After the crash, the job crisis. Back in the city, Carl Warmington got a rude surprise. It was the fall of 1930, a year after the crash. He had just finished his summer orchestra gig at the Breezy Point Lodge and was looking for a new job, but he could not find one. Not in Minneapolis, not anywhere. The economic crisis triggered by the stock market crash, the Great Depression, was spreading quickly through Minnesota and the rest of the nation. By the fall of 1930, private organizations such as the Salvation Army were struggling to provide welfare to a growing population of people without jobs and homes. Warmington thought his college degree would help him find a job even in tough times. He was wrong. "I looked in vain for any kind of full-time position," he recalled. "I watched the want ads and filled out employment applications without a call back." Even though he had no job, Warmington still felt luckier than many people since he had a place to live with his parents. One day in December of 1930, he visited a friend's father. The man worked for a private organization that gave vouchers, or tickets, for meals and lodging to homeless men in Minneapolis. Years later, he described his impressions of what was called the soup line, where people could turn in a voucher to get a hot meal.
What a dark and dreary sight. It had begun to snow, and the wind was howling down this deserted lane. Stretched along the side of an empty building was a long line of shivering men, many with only light jackets. The line reached down the alley to a fire escape that crawled up the side of this dark warehouse to the second floor. The only action from this long queue of men was from their stomping feet in the snow.
So, what did the organization do to help all of these jobless and homeless men? Amala?
They gave them tickets to get.
Yeah, because they're homeless, right? They have no food. So they need to eat somewhere or they're going to literally starve to death. So organizations started up where they would give out vouchers for people to come and get food. They called them soup kitchens. Okay, so the lines were crazy long because it was that bad. There were so many people in need. In today's world, we have places like Catholic Charities where Mr. Gambino works. He is the volunteer coordinator there, and he helps organize the volunteers that come in to prepare the meals and serve the meals. And when it's dinner time or lunchtime and people are coming, they don't have lines nearly as long as there were during the Great Depression. Life is better, but we still have people in need. So we still need to volunteer. We still need to donate to help those people, but it's not as bad as it was back then. Harper.
One of my great grandmas worked at a soup kitchen.
And back during, was it Catholic Schools Week when we did the Toasty Toes collecting socks? It got donated to Mr. Gambino at Catholic Charities, and he helped distribute it to the programs that needed it. So we're still doing our part to help out places like this. Like I said, the need isn't as big as it was back then, but there is still a need. So now we're going to talk about number 8. There are going to be groups of workers that were affected by the job crisis. So we're going to talk about numerous groups. You're going to pick 2. So you're going to put one group up here and one group down here and say how they were affected. So let's listen to who these groups were.
Few jobs, many people. Among the men and women who struggled were those who had worked farms, mined the Iron Range, logged forests, labored in factories, or worked in offices. Now, some who had built up Minnesota's industries were jobless and waiting in line for a chance to eat a hot meal and sleep in a warm bed. Skilled workers fared better than unskilled ones, but people in every industry were hit hard.
So let's hear about those specific groups of people.
Frequently, African Americans and American Indians were the first to be laid off and the last to be hired during these tough economic times. Nearly half the African Americans in Minnesota in 1920 had been born in the South. Many had come north to escape discrimination and seek new opportunities. Although most found the situation in Minnesota an improvement, few were treated as equals by European Americans. For American Indians in Minnesota, the majority of whom lived on reservations, the Great Depression was a continuation of the hard times they had experienced for decades.
So what were 2 groups mentioned in that last paragraph? Robbie?
African Americans and American.
Yeah. How were those groups of people, the African Americans and the American Indians, how were they affected by the job crisis? What was happening with them? Amala?
They're the first to be laid off from their job and the last to get hired.
Yeah. Why do you think they were the first to be laid off and last to get hired when there was openings? Think about what we know about that time period. Why would that be happening, Adeline?
Because people thought, the people that had white skin were the first priority because they were more important.
Yeah. There was still a lot of discrimination at that time. 1960s hadn't happened yet, right? We didn't have Martin Luther King Jr. showing people the error of their ways, right? So back then in the 1930s, people were saying, shh, you're African American. The white men need to keep their jobs. No, you're gonna go first. You're just an American Indian, right? They thought less of them, so they were the first ones to be fired, unfortunately. Thank goodness in today's world, we know it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, what your nationality is, what your religion is. We're looking at human capital. Who has the better skill? Who is going to help the company more? So now we look at different criteria than what they did then. James?
Wait, is there gonna be more groups?
Yeah.
Okay.
See? Next page. More groups.
During this time, men were generally considered the main breadwinners, or economic providers, for families. Women, who made up just over 20% of the American workforce in 1930, often lost their jobs in favor of keeping men employed. Most women were married, and most of their husbands were still employed, but their wages had been cut dramatically. Others had husbands who had lost their jobs altogether. Just as men did, women struggled to provide for themselves and their families during this economic crisis.
So in this paragraph, they're talking about the men versus the women, right? How were men affected by the job crisis? Adeline?
Me too. African Americans and American Indians were two separate ones.
Yep, I said we were gonna learn about multiple, you had to pick two. How were men affected? Was everything just great for the white men? Was their life golden? What was happening with them? What did our paragraph just say? There should be more than one person who is listening. Look back at the paragraph. James?
Men's money got like laid off.
So just because you were a white man doesn't mean you were 100% protected. There were still men that got laid off, right? They did lose their jobs. They were the last to get laid off and the first to get hired. So it wasn't as bad as the African Americans or as the American Indians, because they were the last to be fired, but they still did lose their jobs. What about the women? How were women affected? Because remember in the 1920s, during the Jazz Age, women, different behaviors, women were starting to work outside of the house. There were a lot more jobs, they were going to college. So what happened during the 30s, Robbie?
There was like women, like most women were, they got often lose their jobs.
Yeah. Why would they lay off the woman before they would lay off the man? Addie?
Because the men had more rights.
Not quite more rights. I mean, you're not altogether wrong on that, but that's not the reason they gave it to them. Why would employers say, okay, I've got a man and a woman, I'm gonna let the woman go and have the man keep his job? Natalie?
Because the men were usually the providers for the family, and the woman would do like the at-home work.
So think about the jobs that we learned about in the 1920s that women were doing. They were doing clerical work. They were the administrative assistants. They weren't the boss, right? The men were the boss, the women were the secretaries that helped them. So The boss has a big paycheck, the secretary has a small paycheck. So people were saying, well, we're gonna try to keep the men's jobs because they are providing more for their families. The women go back home and work at home. We don't want to have to do it, but we have to lay people off. Like, that's the nature of the beast, it's the depression. So they're saying we're gonna keep the people who provide more for the family, so we're keeping the men. In today's world, there's a lot of times women have the higher paying job and their husband has a lower paying, it doesn't matter. It just depends on how the husband and wife, what occupations they're going into. It's individual. Back then, it was the majority, right? So the men were the ones making more than the women. That's just what life was like back then. Adeline.
So there was like an African American man, an African American woman. Would the woman get fired first?
Yes. So in those groups, the American Indians, the African Americans, they would keep the man over the women. So the women were the first to go. Then it was the African Americans and the American Indians. Women, just go back home, take care of the family, take care of your house.
Would a white woman go before them?
That's a great question. I tend to think maybe the women would go before the men. And then when it comes to the men, the white men would keep their job over the African American or the American Indians. So Carl Warmington, we know he was having a hard time finding a job. Yeah, he's got a college degree, he's got his human capital, but there's just no jobs out there. So let's see what happens with him.
A job for Carl Warmington. In early 1931, Carl Warmington finally landed an office job with the city of Minneapolis. Before long, he was transferred to the city's Department of Public Relief, the agency that helped people who needed housing, food, counseling, health care, and clothing. By this time, about 35,000 people in a workforce of 212,000, 1 in 6, had lost their jobs in Minneapolis.
1 out of 6 people had lost their jobs. They needed a lot of help. So Carl Warmington found a job helping those people. James? Can we wait so we don't miss out?
Over the next few years, Warmington and his fellow relief workers tried hard to make life better for the thousands of Minneapolis residents who needed help. Still, there was only so much Warmington's office could do. The Great Depression was a national or federal crisis, not a city crisis. City funds were limited, Warmington recalled. It was not until federal funds were made available that improved care for homeless people was possible.
So Warmington's working with the city of Minneapolis. So the city only has so much money. There's only so much help we can do. We needed aid from the federal government. We need that federal government to start helping us. The whole country did. So let's see what changes happen in the federal government for the United States.
A new president is elected. In 1932, the American people elected a new president with a new vision. Franklin D. Roosevelt had won by promising a New Deal for the American people. His first challenge was to fight panic among Americans and restore their confidence in the country's economic system. Within his first 100 days in office, the federal government passed 15 bills to deal with the crisis. The executive and legislative branches of the government worked together to make this happen. President Roosevelt proposed each bill, Congress passed it, and then the president signed it into law.
So, President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A lot of times he goes by FDR. So if you hear about FDR, he is the president during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt. He has a relative, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who was president before his time. So there are 2 President Roosevelts. We're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, FDR. So remember the stock market crashed in 1929. It's now 1932 and things are getting worse and worse and worse, not better. So everybody's freaking out, right? The country is not in a good place. And they're saying, we need something to change. We need life to get better. So they elect a new president because he has a new deal that he's going to start bringing in, new policies to help change. The first 100 days that he's in office, he's already starting to do new policies to help the people of the United States get better. Minnesota being one of the states benefits from these policies that he puts into place. So this is a big deal.
To gain public support, the president took his ideas and his programs straight to the American people. He started a series of radio broadcasts called Fireside Chats. Many Americans approved of Roosevelt's plans, which were called the New Deal. Those who did felt hope for the future now that the government was trying to relieve their misery.
People are worried, lost their jobs, they know lots of people who are losing their houses, they're having a hard time even being able to afford food to eat. So people are scared. So Franklin Roosevelt knows, hey, I need to do more than just put policies into place. I need to talk to the people. I need to give them hope. So he does these fireside chats. Why do you think they were on the radio? Natalie?
So that everyone could listen to it?
Why wouldn't they have been on the TV? Like, that's how we get our news now, TV, the internet. Why were they using the radio, Harper? They didn't have TVs yet. They definitely didn't have the internet, right? So that was the best way to communicate to everyone. If you didn't have a radio, your neighbor did, and FDR's coming on and he's gonna do one of his fireside chats, and people would gather around, okay? So like Natalie said, that was the best way to reach the most amount of people. Because if, like I said, if you didn't have a radio, you knew somebody who did. So you could all get together to hear his uplifting talks that he was giving and getting hope. So let's look at the New Deal. So that's our sidebar. Number 9, how did the New Deal change the role of the federal government? There's always a back and forth. How much power should the government have? How much power should the states have? The way that our government is set up, it kind of goes back and forth on it. So we're going to see how that power shift changes during the Great Depression.
So what? The New Deal. The New Deal was an experiment. No one really knew how to end the Great Depression. President Roosevelt and his advisors based their ideas on the progressive view that government could and should improve economic conditions for all Americans. Though the New Deal failed to end the Great Depression, it did provide work and welfare for the unemployed. The New Deal also greatly enlarged the federal government. For example, government began to regulate or make rules for banks and the stock market. It also began programs that assisted farmers and unemployed workers. These programs were designed to increase the general well-being of the people. Many Americans loved Roosevelt. Many others disliked him. Generally, public opinion divided along class lines. Those hit hardest by the Depression, especially farmers and laborers, helped elect him to a record 4 terms. The wealthy, including bankers and big business leaders, often accused him of making government larger and more expensive. They believed the New Deal would hurt the American economic system. Today, people still debate how involved government should be in their lives.
Why did the farmers and the laborers like FDR so much? Why do you think they would have liked him? What was he doing for them? Why would they elect him to 4 terms? What was he doing, Eleanor?
He was promising things and doing.
Yeah, he's helping them. He's getting them jobs. He's getting the welfare out there. He's helping them to get food, to get those jobs. So he's helping. Why do you think the businessmen and the bankers, why do you think they didn't like him? What problem do you think they had with his policies? James?
I think people got less money because they're helping around.
Think about the jobs that they have, the bankers
Um,
and the businessmen. Why would they not like what he's doing? Adeline?
Because the people that are getting hired don't know what they're doing and they're taking like other people's jobs.
So I see where you're going with that, but the programs that he set up to get jobs to people, we're gonna hear about what kind of programs they were. So he wasn't making banks hire people who shouldn't be working at a bank. So he had other programs, other jobs that he created for them to be able to do. And like I said, we're gonna learn about those in a minute. So it's a good thought, but not quite the right track. Kylie, what were you thinking? They're making the government larger. How is the federal government changing? It's getting more power. They're saying, oh, we need to put regulations on this. Banks lost all of this money when everybody was pulling their money out of the bank. We need to put some stipulations on there. We need to make the banks have more laws put to them so it doesn't happen again. Well, are the banks and the businessmen gonna like having new rules put on them? No, they want to have the freedom that they did have. Bridget, do you need to sharpen your pencil? Okay, because if you do, just let me know and I'll stop talking. Okay. So the government gets more power, and today, there's still arguments back and forth. How much power should the federal government have? How much power should the state governments have? How should it work? Should the federal government make all these rules, or should it be states that get to make more of their rules? It's a constant conversation that's always happening. And that's a good thing, right? We should always be asking those questions. What can make us the strongest? Back then, FDR said, well, it's important that the federal government makes these rules because states are struggling so much. So there's a lot of power that was given. Another thing that I want to point out in here, how many terms did FDR, was he president, Natalie? 4 terms. How many terms can a president be a president nowadays? Amala? How many terms, not years? 2 terms. A term is 4 years. So they can be elected 2 times, and then they cannot be elected anymore because of FDR. Because people kept electing him over and over and over again. People were getting worried. They're like, wait, we don't want a king that sits in office until they die. That's what happened with FDR in his 4th term, is when he passed away. Otherwise, he would have been elected a 5th term, right? But he passed away, and people were like, no, we separated from England because we didn't want a king who could be there for his lifetime. So they changed the rules so you can only be elected 2 terms, and then somebody else comes in. So it's a constant changing of that leadership. So it's not just one person that's in it for so long. So now let's look after the crash. So that's number 10. Name one way a federal program helped the Toso family. So remember, the Toso family we learned about is a family in Otter Tail County. Very, like all of the other farmers in the area. So there's different programs that were put into place to help the farmers, because the farmers were struggling. So we're going to look at programs that were put in place.
In 1933, a new federal agency called the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, started a program to raise prices for farm goods. This would provide relief for farmers. President Roosevelt went on the radio to explain how the AAA would work. Many farmers, including Conrad and Elizabeth Toso, were skeptical at first. He promised us that he was going to give everybody work, Conrad recalled. And of course, that puzzled us. We wondered how he could do that. The Tosos' questions were answered the following year when drought struck a large part of Minnesota, including Otter Tail County. Fields dried up from lack of rain. Farmers could not find enough feed to keep their dairy cows alive. Conrad Toso, for example, resorted to feeding his cows Russian thistle, a plant that was hard for the animals to digest. Then the federal government stepped in. The AAA offered to buy any cattle that farmers in Otter Tail County could not afford to keep. The Tosos sold 6 of their 10 cows for $20 apiece. The money they received from this New Deal program helped them get through the summer.
So they have 10 cows. He's having to feed them poor quality feed that is not good for the cow's digestion, but it's at a cheap price that he could afford. So he's saying, oh, I'll buy the Russian thistle so at least they're getting something, but it is not good for the cows. So the cows are sick, right? They're not eating good food. They're getting sick, they're dying. So the program that comes about says, hey, you know what? We're gonna buy back your cattle that you can't afford. So he's able to sell back 6 of his 10 cows. So now he has money to feed the 4 cows that he kept. He could feed them the good food so they can produce what they're supposed to produce. They can produce good milk. They can get big and strong if there were beef cattle, right? So they could be big and strong. So instead of having 10 sickly dying and not getting much for them, they could sell some off so they could really take care of those animals that they were able to keep. So that was one program.
More help on the way. In 1936, drought struck again, and another federal agency came to the rescue. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, provided money to put people to work. It paid for public projects such as repairing schools, improving roads, and building new ball fields. In Otter Tail County, drought-stricken farmers worked on WPA road projects and received livestock feed and crop seeds as payment. It was hard work hacking through brush to clear the way for new roads, but Conrad Toso was happy to do it. There were no jobs to get whatsoever, he recalled. It was the only thing you could do.
So this is what I was talking about, Adeline. When he promised those new jobs to people, he wasn't saying, oh, we're going to get you these high-skilled jobs. He wasn't taking over that where you have no business doing something that you have no idea how to do it. They were creating jobs that were low-skill jobs, but able to get them the feed and the seeds that they need to keep their farms running. It doesn't take a lot of skill to clear out all of the brush for new roads, right? It's hard work, and they got compensated for that hard work, but it was unskilled labor that they were able to do. So they weren't taking over jobs they shouldn't have, they were creating new jobs that they would be able to do. So that's another program that helped the Toso family. So before we finish off the chapter, let's do that number 11, the Indian New Deal. We're going to explain one of the reforms that was part of the Indian New Deal.
The Indian New Deal. In the 1930s, the federal government passed laws that changed life on American Indian reservations. These 1934 laws came to be known as the Indian New Deal. The main reform was called the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA. The IRA provided American Indian nations with the ability to control their own affairs more than they had for many years. It was intended to overturn previous U.S. government policies that had interfered with the sovereignty of American Indian nations. The IRA ended the policy of allotment, which had reduced the amount of land American Indians owned on their reservations. It also enabled tribes to create independent tribal governments to serve their people. These were overseen by an agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. American Indian nations had to vote to adopt this new tribal government plan. The law was not perfect. For example, it created a governmental structure that ignored traditional Indian leadership. Still, it was a change, and some American Indian nations agreed to it. Another part of the Indian New Deal was the Johnson-O'Malley Act. This law dealt with education. The Johnson-O'Malley Act, or JOM as it came to be known, gave public schools money to cover the costs of educating American Indian students, rather than providing separate schools for them. Although these reforms were not perfect, many American Indians believed they were a step in the right direction, an improvement over previous policies and laws.
So, what were some of the things that they talked about in there? What were some changes that they made for the American Indians? Sarah?
The Johnson-O'Malley Act gave public schools, like, they gave money to, like, provide for, like, the American Indians, so they could go to schools instead of separate schools.
Yeah, because remember in the 1960s, we know how the African Americans had one school and the white kids went to a different school, and then in the 60s they got integrated. Well, it was the same thing with the American Indians. They had their separate school. Do you think that separate school was well funded? No. It was not quality education that they were getting. So they changed it up and said, you know what? We're going to let you be able to come to these public schools so you can get a good education. What was another program, Robbie?
The IRA provided with American Indian nations with like the ability to control affairs and more than they had in
Yeah, so they're given back the power to rule themselves. Instead of having to have all of the government tell them exactly what to do, they got some of that own power back so they could have the culture that they wanted.
They gave them, or they reduced the amount of the land on the reservation.
They reduced the amount of land?
Oh, they increased.
They increased, right? Because remember, we learned how they had the allotment happening, where the Ojibwe on their reservation said, this is all Ojibwe land, we share. And then the government said, no, you need to do the allotment, and this is your land for your farm, and it's all separated and broken up, and they actually ended up losing a lot of land. Well, now the government's like, you know what, we're gonna get rid of allotment, that wasn't really working for you. We're giving you the power to control it yourselves. You guys can go back to living how you want to live with your own culture. Yes?
So they reduced it and then gave them more?
So it's not that they gave them more land, but they said, so the allotment had reduced the amount of land the American Indians had. So they weren't necessarily giving land back to the reservation, but they took away the allotment so it wouldn't hurt them anymore. So they got rid of the allotment program because it wasn't helping. So now the American Indians could be on the land how they want to be on the land. So let's see how we can close off with...
Of all the New Deal agencies, none was as popular in rural Minnesota as the Rural Electrification Administration, REA. In the 1930s, most Minnesota farms had no electricity. The REA set out to change that.
If you wanted
It encouraged farmers to join together to form cooperatives, associations that would help them set up electricity. Then, the REA funneled money to these organized groups. This money was used to provide low-cost loans to farmers who wanted to bring electricity to their farms. The cooperatives bought electricity from existing power plants and then built power lines to carry that electricity to the farms.
So remember, electricity was new back then. People didn't have electricity at all. They were trying to bring it out to the farms to help the farms get stronger and to help the farms be able to survive. That electricity made a huge difference. So they didn't have the cash for it. Sometimes it took 10 to 15 years to get out to all the farther out farms, right? The farms that were close to town got it first. It takes longer to build the lines to get out farther and farther, but they were able to get electricity out to the farms. So now electricity is all over. Back then, they were just starting to get it. So this program really helped the farmers be able to get that electricity.
The New Deal pumped more than $1 billion into Minnesota between 1933 and 1939. It put people to work, gave people hope, and propped up the economy. It also convinced many Minnesotans that government could, and should, play an active role in people's lives. Yet even with all these benefits, the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. Farm prices remained low, and millions of people were still out of work. It would take another world war to shake the United States and Minnesota out of their long economic nightmare.
So remember, the 1930s was the Great Depression. Just because FDR came in and made all these policies and he had the New Deal and it was helping and giving hope, it's not what ultimately ended that Great Depression. What does end the Depression? World War II does. Okay, because remember the farmers after World War I, they had a hard time because people weren't buying the food as much as they had during the war. People didn't, during the Great Depression, people didn't have jobs. So 1939, the war breaks out in Europe, doesn't become a world war until Pearl Harbor when the United States joins in. Then we have people becoming soldiers. Do you get paid to be a soldier?
Oh, yeah. Very little.
You do get paid, okay? It's a job. So that opened up a whole bunch of new jobs for people to have. Are the farmers gonna do better? Yeah, because now they have the military they have to feed again, right? So this helps the final push to get us out of the Great Depression. So FDR and the New Deal helped, gave hope. It made it so it didn't get worse. It was slowly starting to get better. And then World War II helped to end it. Adeline.
Wouldn't the same thing happen after World War II? Like, because then...
Well, the stock market doesn't crash because they put new regulations in place so it wouldn't happen again. So that's a good thought. Well, after World War II, people aren't going to have the jobs or the money. The farmers are going to hurt. But they learned. Because remember, we should always learn from our past to make things better so bad things don't repeat. All right, with that, I'm going to try to get this posted onto my YouTube channel if it will finally work for me. You should be done, listening ears. You should be done with the comprehension page. Make sure your name is on it. If you are all done, turn it into the gray tray. I will be correcting it.